For this week's homework, the problems that seemed to cause the most difficulty involved completing the square. So we're going to take a look at a few of those problems, including how to find the constant term to complete the square, how to factor the perfect square trinomial, and then how to use completing the square to solve a quadratic equation. Our first problem asks us to complete the square and then factor the resulting trinomial. So to complete the square, the trick is to look at the coefficient of the linear term. So that's the negative 6x in this problem. You need to do two things to that number. First of all, take that coefficient and divide it by 2. And yes, it's always divide by 2. So negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. And then take that negative 3, the number that you got when you divided by 2, and square it. So negative 3 squared is negative 3 times negative 3, which is 9. So 9 is the number that completes the square. So x squared minus 6x plus 9 is a perfect square trinomial. Now the second part of the problem asks us to factor the resulting trinomial. Since this is a perfect square trinomial, we know that it will factor into some binomial that's been squared. X squared is going to come from x times x, so that's the first term in our binomial. To get the second term, all we have to do is look back at the number that we got when we divided by 2, and that's negative 3. So that means the second term in our binomial is negative 3. So x squared minus 6x plus 9 factors into x minus 3 quantity squared. Now this problem has exactly the same instructions and will follow exactly the same procedure. We want to complete the square first, then factor the resulting trinomial. We'll look for the coefficient of the linear term, so that's the 1/2, and we need to do two things to it. First, we need to take that 1/2 and divide it by 2. It might be helpful to remember that dividing by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal of 2, which is 1/2. So 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/4. Then after we divide by 2, we're going to take that number, 1/4, and square it. 1/4 times 1/4 is 1/16. So the number that completes the square is 1/16. And if we write x squared plus 1/2 x plus 1/16, we've written a perfect square trinomial. Now because it's a perfect square trinomial, it will factor into a binomial that's been squared. The first term in the binomial is going to be x. That's where the x squared comes from. It's x times x. And to find the second term in the binomial, all we have to do is look back and see what number we got when we divided that linear term by 2. We got a 1/4. So the second term in the binomial is 1/4. So x squared plus 1/2 x plus 1/16 factors into x plus 1/4 quantity squared. Now one of the uses of completing the square is that we can solve quadratic equations with it. That's what we want to do here. Solve this equation by completing the square. So the first thing we're going to do is complete the square on the side of the equation with the variable. And we'll do that by looking for the coefficient of the linear term, which is negative 4. And you know what we're going to do with that. Divide by 2 and squared. So first, negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. And then negative 2, quantity squared, is positive 4. So if we want to complete the square on the side of the equation with the variable, we're going to add that 4 to the left side of the equation. That gives us a perfect square trinomial on the left, but this is an equation and we have to keep a balanced equation. So if we add 4 to the left side of this equation, we need to add 4 to the right side to keep a balanced equation. The left side we know is a perfect square trinomial that we can factor into a binomial squared. The first term in the binomial is x, and the second term we can find by looking to see what number we got when we divided that linear coefficient by 2. That was negative 2. So x minus 2 quantity squared is the same as x squared minus 4x plus 4. On the right side of the equation, we've got negative 6 plus 4, and that's negative 2. Now the left side is a perfect square. So in order to solve for x, we can use the square root property, which says that if we take the square root of both sides of an equation, we still have a balanced equation. So we'll take the square root of the left side, and we'll take the square root of the right side. We do need to do one more thing, though. Because we're looking for a square root, and we know that every number does have 2 square roots, we're going to show that with a plus or minus right here. So the square root of x minus 2, quantity squared, is plus or minus the square root of negative 2. The left side, the square root of x minus 2 squared, is just x minus 2, because the square and the square root are inverse operations. And on the right side, we do have a negative 2 under the radical, which is negative 1 times 2, and the square root of negative 1 is I. So the right side we can write as I times the square root of 2. One more step and we're there. In order to solve this equation and get the x by itself, we need to add 2 to both sides of the equation. That'll leave us with an x on the left side, and on the right side we'll have 2 plus or minus I times the square root of 2. So we've found 2 complex solutions to our quadratic equation by completing the square.